Hey guys, I'm Sparrow Knowledge, and this is the location where student leaders Lonnie King, Julian Bond, and Joseph Pierce gathered students from Morehouse College, Atlanta University, Clark College, now Clark Atlanta University, the Interdimensional Theological Center, Morris Brown College, and Spelman College gathered to rally students to start nonviolent protests. This is the Atlanta Student Movement. Let's start in 1960, Charlotte, North Carolina. On February 1st, 1960, 4 black men from North Carolina A&T, Ezell Blair Jr., Franklin McCain, Joseph McNeil, and David Richmond sit down at Woolworth's whites-only lunch counter. This moment in North Carolina sparked the students of Atlanta HBCUs and others to come together for equality. Lonnie King's oral history interview conducted by Emily Crosby for the Library of Congress discusses how he and some of his colleagues started the Atlanta student movement.
When the Greensboro Four sat down on February the 1st, I was reading the newspaper at Yates and Milton, and I went to my good friend Joseph Pierce and said, Joe, why don't we organize and do something here? And he read it. He said, okay, let's do it. And I said, let's go talk to this guy over here. I said, I met him in '57. He was a Time magazine intern when he was in high school, so he should be able to write. We need to have somebody who can write well with us to tell the story as we organize. And that guy was Julian Bond.
The presidents of the HBCUs in Atlanta called the members of the movement in for a meeting. Most of the presidents wanted the students to let the NAACP lawyers handle the situation of inequality that was going on in Atlanta. When it was time for the students to speak, Lonnie King spoke up.
Who's going to speak for the students? So everybody looked at me because I was the agitator. So I started speaking, and I laid out the premises. This thing is growing. The AU Center has always been a citadel of learning for African Americans, and there's no reason why we should be left behind, so forth and so on. When I finished, Dr. Clement said, we still think you ought to let the NAACP handle this thing legally. However, why don't you write a manifesto and tell the public why you are doing this? He said, you're from the AU Center. We need to have an intellectual document that you draft, not us, but you draft, that would set forth why you were doing whatever it is you might do later on.
That document was an appeal for human rights. They presented the document stating their concern for the issues that went on not only in Atlanta, but all around America. They stated concerns about education, jobs, housing, voting, hospitals, movies, concerts, and restaurants, and law enforcement. Rosalind Pope was assigned to help write the document stating this at the dedication of Atlanta Student Movement Boulevard in Atlanta about why the document was written.
Our appeal further announced to the citizens of Atlanta, the country, and the world that we, the students of the Atlanta University Center, would no longer wait placidly for those rights which were legally and morally ours to be meted out to us one at a time. We stated, today's youth will not sit by submissively while being denied all of the rights, privileges, and joys of life. We went on to say, we want to state clearly and unequivocally that we cannot tolerate in a nation professing democracy and among people professing Christianity the discriminatory conditions under which we were living in Atlanta, Georgia, supposedly one of the most progressive cities in the South.
On March 9, 1960, the document was advertised in local newspapers, including the Atlanta Constitution, Atlanta Journal, and the Atlanta Daily World. The students called themselves the Committee on the Appeal for Human Rights. 6 days after it was published, the students orchestrated sit-ins in 10 lunch counters and cafeterias. Richards was the most popular department store in Atlanta at the time and also had segregation rules. You could see students' signs saying Richards sells segregation and don't buy here. The KKK counter-protests and things started to become hostile. The students received help from adults, forming the Student-Adult Liaison Committee. Julian Bond describes how he contributed at the beginning of the movement before starting Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC.
I was the publicist. I was the guy who, if the newspapers called, I would talk to them, or reporters called. If we were wanted to put out a statement, I would write the statement. So I was the publicist. I was the fountain of knowledge.
Yeah.
I was the spin master. I was the interpreter of what we did. I interpreted what we did to the larger world.
And then, what was the Atlanta Inquirer?
Well, there was a daily black newspaper in Atlanta which was Republican-oriented and very conservative. And it was hostile to what we were doing.
Okay.
Because we were picketing an A&P store, and A&P was a big advertiser for them. And A&P took their ads out and they got mad, so they began to attack us. So a group of black real estate men, Atlanta is a fairly wealthy black community, a lot of black businesses, and these real estate guys said to us, we'll take our ads out of the Atlanta World for a week to teach them a lesson.
Yeah.
And while they took their ads out, white real estate companies began encroaching on their market. So they said, hey, this can't be. So they said, why don't you put together some paper to compete with the world? And so with the help of some adults, in fact, with the adults doing most of the real work, we put together this newspaper called the Atlanta Inquirer Weekly. And I began working for the paper. And I ghost wrote a column for Lonnie King called Let Freedom Ring by Lonnie King.
Students tried to compromise with the segregated businesses and lunch counters of Atlanta, but many did not change their rules until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. On October 19, 1960, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke about the civil rights movement after being arrested during the sit-in at Richards' department store. This was his first arrest, a part of the civil rights movement.
To the forefront of the community and to cause the people in our community to change their attitudes so that the situation can be changed.
It was announced just the other day that variety stores in 112 southern cities would voluntarily integrate their lunch counters and cafeterias. I take it you do not feel this is sufficient progress?
It represents real progress, but it certainly isn't enough. The 112 cities included are in border states and in the middle states. None of the cities are found in the deep South, the hardcore South. And we feel that if the progress is to be meaningful progress, it must include the deep South, including Atlanta. And I'm sure that with the reasonable climate in Atlanta, it is possible to desegregate lunch counters without any real difficulty, and the transition could be a very smooth one.
Thanks for watching. Please support Black-owned businesses, and peace, love, and knowledge. Till next time.